All right, so we're moving into the second chapter, or second chapter in our institutions unit. Following Congress is the executive branch. And I'm very purposeful to not simply say the presidency, because the executive branch is more than the presidency. Now, we are going to obviously talk disproportionately about the president, um, but I want to begin this unit by being clear that the executive branch is more than that. I'll also say that we're beginning the first day of this unit lecturing via a Google Classroom assignment, which is less than ideal, but you know what? We'll do what we can. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. So the first question we want to look at is just fundamentally how we started with our Congress unit, right? Which is who are members of Congress? Who are our presidents? What are the stipulations? What do they have to be? Number one, they need to be 35 years old and cut off there, but 35 years old and a natural born citizen. Now you'll notice that second requirement is different than what we talked about for members of Congress. We said for members of Congress, right, you could be a naturalized citizen. You just had to be a naturalized U.S. citizen for 7 years for the House or 9 years for the Senate. But for the president, the constitutional requirement is higher, have to be a natural born citizen. And the reason for this is obviously within the executive branch and the person running the country, um, they're worried obviously about like deep state foreign operatives being placed in the United States to be fast risers that could be corrupted and foreign agents, and it's the stuff for good spy films, but that is the constitutional check. The other thing, in addition to being a natural born citizen, is that they have to have lived in the US the last 14 years. Um, they cannot have lived abroad and then come back. They had to have lived in the United States. And the reason for this is, again, guarding against corruption by um, foreign powers. All right, we're going to try this again. I had to start and stop a couple times in the first 2 minutes of this lecture because I was at school and kids need stuff. But we picked up by saying, 35 years old, natural born citizen, has to have lived in the US for the last 14 years. We talked about why. We also look at religious qualifications or consistency/patterns, and we find that the vast majority of presidents have been Protestant, with the exception of John F. Kennedy and Joe Biden. Joe Biden was also a Catholic. Now, this quote right here, obviously, we don't need to copy down, but it's worth kind of following along with me as I read because I think it really captures the answer to this. Who are our presidents? Constitution says 35 years old, natural born citizen, but that's about it. Since 1953, the White House has been home to a war hero, Eisenhower, a Boston Irish politician, Kennedy, a small town Texas boy who grew up to be the biggest wheeler dealer in the Senate, Lyndon Baines Johnson, California lawyer described by his enemies as Tricky Dick, that's Nixon, and his friends as a misunderstood master of national leadership, again Nixon, a former Rose Bowl player who had spent his entire political career in the House of Representatives, Gerald Ford, a former governor who had been a Georgia peanut wholesaler, Jimmy Carter, an actor who was also a former governor of California, Ronald Reagan, a CIA chief, an ambassador who was the son of a U.S. Senator, George H.W. Bush, an ambitious governor from a small state, Bill Clinton, a former managing director of a Major League Baseball team who had won his first election only 6 years before becoming president, George W. Bush, and a young black man who had served in national office for only 4 years before assuming the role of commander in chief. That's Barack Hussein Obama. Continuing, how do presidents become president? Let's look at that. We've looked at elections, we've looked at nomination campaigns, we've looked at, the invisible campaign and all that. So let's look at it from the lens of the executive branch chapter. Number one, we know that the vast majority of presidents are elected through the electoral process. Now, this might seem exceedingly obvious the first time you hear it, because you're like, yeah, no duh, how else would they be elected? But I mean, think about it for a second, right? Some presidents have taken over because they were vice president and the president died in office, or president resigned because of threat of impeachment. Now, the vast majority of presidents also, well, maybe not the vast majority, but the majority of presidents typically serve 2 or more terms. 2 or more, meaning Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but the others serve not just their first term, but also get reelected for a second term. Now, after FDR, we know that the 22nd Amendment was passed to limit this, what was perceived as overreach of the executive, and to limit presidents from serving more than 2 terms or 10 years. Now, the way I remember this, because there's another 20 amendment that you need to remember, is 22nd is 2 terms. 22, 2 terms. 22nd Amendment, 2 terms. It prevents a president from serving more than 2 terms or 10 years, meaning a president can become president because their president dies in office in their second year and they take over, and then they can serve 2 additional. But if they died in the first year, they would only be permitted to serve out the rest of the term and 1 other one. Now, 6 presidents have decided against running for a second term. Lyndon Baines Johnson was the most famous one, who realized how vulnerable he was because of Vietnam and just said, screw it, I'm just going to finish serving out this term. And 5 others in addition to LBJ have decided, it's not worth it, I don't want to run for a second term. 10 have lost re-election, we'll say 11 now because of Donald Trump. 11 have lost re-election and only served 1. They ran for a second one, but did not win. Now, 10% of all presidents, it's now down to 9, but 10% of all presidents who've been our president have not been elected, right? Whether it's Gerald Ford taking over for Nixon or LBJ taking over for Kennedy. Because they were vice presidents at the time of presidential death, or whoever took over for William Henry Harrison. I don't even know. I'm not a world history guy. Now, the other 20s amendment that you need to know is the 25th Amendment. Now, the 25th Amendment specifies how a new vice president is selected, basically saying that the vice president is selected by the president. Now, this is directly dealing with when a president is deemed unfit to serve. Now, we talked about this in the Trump presidency when he started to kind of show a lot of very weird behaviors and in questionably, like, is this guy senile? Is this guy doing all sorts of crazy things? There was talk of invoking the 25th. The 25th Amendment was passed as a way to remove a president from office who hadn't committed high crimes and misdemeanors and therefore couldn't be impeached, but was deemed otherwise unfit to serve, right? It was passed as a result of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, as we talked about, was famously had a stroke while he was in office, and for about 8 months, his wife was basically acting as president, which, isn't a problem because she's a woman, but because of the fact that she was never elected. She was serving as president of the United States, but was never elected by the American people. That was obviously problematic in a democracy, to have your president not be an elected politician. Now, once that president is removed from office for being unfit to serve because they're in a coma or because they're going crazy. That process is a majority of sitting cabinet members vote to get rid of him out of office or her, and then the new president would be able to nominate their vice president, and it would be approved by Congress. This also, as I said, allows the vice president to take over at times when the president is unfit, when the cabinet and the vice president determine that they are unfit. So the 2 amendments dealing with the executive that you need to know are the 22nd, 2 terms, and then the 25th, which is how do you remove a crazy president, essentially, and then how do you pick a vice president afterwards. Here is the list of people that we said 10% of people or 10% of presidents were not elected. That's the column on the right because their president died in office or was removed in office. William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, Abraham Lincoln, and then most famously Richard Nixon, John F. Kennedy. Um, now, how can a president be removed from office? This almost seems like an unnecessary question in 2021 when merely being a government student means you probably have some familiarity with this. But the short answer is that the Constitution, the founders did put in the Constitution a provision to allow for the removal of a president if they commit what's called high crimes, misdemeanors, treason. Now, this is vague legal language and has been interpreted at different times to mean different things, right? We know that Garfield, who followed, no, is it Garfield? Hold on. Yeah, okay, so Garfield, who followed Abraham Lincoln, was impeached by the House because basically he was doing a terrible job in the eyes of the House of Representatives. He was not convicted. But this constitutional provision allows for the removal of presidents. We have seen our most recent president, 45, Donald J. Trump, be impeached twice. Now, this is important because last point is important, right? Because when I say poor performance does not allow for impeachment, that idea of just being bad at the job does not constitute high crimes, treason, or misdemeanors. Is the basis for the 25th Amendment, which is the removal of a president for simply being unfit for office. So you can't impeach for being terrible at the job, but you can remove from office if the vice president and a majority of the cabinet vote to invoke the 25th Amendment. And obviously, we heard that a lot in the last 18 months of the Trump presidency. Okay, now we know as we should have seen over the last 18 months that the process for impeachment of the sitting U.S. president is very specific as defined by the Constitution. It is a two-step process, with the first step being a vote to impeach by the U.S. House of Representatives. You can think of this as sort of the U.S. House of Representatives acting as a district attorney in choosing whether or not to bring charges. The U.S. House of Representatives may say, we choose to bring charges, we vote to impeach, and then once that is done, the Senate then, by constitutional mandate, has to take up an official impeachment trial. And so the Senate will hold the impeachment trial, which is the second part in this step. Now, as we talked about today, with regards to the most recent impeachment trial, for a normal impeachment where the president is a sitting U.S. president, the Constitution is very clear that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has to preside over the trial and act as the sitting judge. Now, we saw in the second impeachment trial of Donald J. Trump, where John Roberts was not the presiding judge. Instead, that went to the Senate pro tempore, or Patrick Leahy of Vermont. And the reason, as I said today, was because he's not a sitting president anymore. So the Constitution has no say in who presides over that trial. But as Raquel will tell you, not sure if you know, but you have a badass in your midst. Raquel was chosen. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Raquel, and make you feel a little awkward, but Raquel was chosen during the first impeachment trial of Donald J. Trump when she was a Senate page for Senator Bennett's office. She was chosen to be the lead page one day, and she was tasked with walking questions handwritten on pieces of paper by senators wanting to ask witnesses. She was tasked with delivering those handwritten questions from the senators themselves 2, Chief Justice John Roberts presiding over the trial.